Hello, my name is Michelle Ruiz, and I am the program coordinator at the US Latinx Art Forum. Before we begin our program, I would like to take a moment to honor our ancestral grounds and support Indigenous peoples' ongoing stewardship to protect their homelands. I'm broadcasting from my home in Berwyn, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Council of Three Fires, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The US Latinx Art Forum champions artists and art professionals through initiatives that advance the vitality of Latinx art and foster an intergenerational network that spans academia, art institutions, and collections. In 2021, we partnered with the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Foundation for the Arts to administer the Latinx Artist Fellowship. This fellowship awards $50,000 in unrestricted funds to each member of a multi-generational cohort of 15 visual artists each year for an initial commitment of 5 years. It is the first significant prize of its kind and celebrates the plurality and diversity of Latinx artists and aesthetics. It is designed to address the systemic and longstanding lack of philanthropic and institutional support for Latinx artists, and we are honored to be a partner in this groundbreaking initiative. Next slide, please. It is my pleasure to welcome you to XS Intersection Diasporic Legacies and introduce our moderators for this conversation. Rose Salseda, co-founder and director of research initiatives at the US Latinx Art Forum, and Mari Carmen Ramírez, Wortham curator of the Latin American Art and director of International Center for the Arts of Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. We plan to close our events with a Q&A, and I invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A function below. In addition, simultaneous interpretation is available from English to Spanish. To access this language channels, go to the globe icon at the bottom of your computer screen or click More if you are on a tablet or phone. If you need interpretation or help troubleshooting, please send a message via the chat. The instructions to get into the Spanish channel will also be put in the chat as well. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today as we look at the work of and hold conversations with artists Maria Magdalena Campos-Pons, Lucia Hierro, and Rosemary Meza-DesPlas. As Mari Carmen and I began planning today's panel, we were unsure at first how to relate the diverse artworks and mediums that each artist is well known for, such as Lucia's fabric sculptures of consumer goods, Magda's photographic reflections of herself and her family legacies, and Rosemary's figurative art made with human hair. However, through our continued discussion of their works, we became struck by the various ways the experiences of migration and diaspora have informed their art practices. This includes the firsthand experiences of moving from the Caribbean to the United States and the transnational experience of growing up in two countries, as well as the influence of family oral histories about migrating from Mexico to permanently live in the United States, and the family experience of regularly crossing national borders for work. The three artists' works are inflected by these experiences to varying degrees, sometimes surfacing through direct subject matter or by more conceptual means. For tonight's panel, we asked our colleagues to share 3 slides of their artworks and discuss the images before Mari Carmen and I ask questions for them to elaborate on how the legacies of Latin American and Caribbean diaspora have informed their art practices. But before we move on to this segment, Mari Carmen, would like to briefly share in more detail the impact of diaspora on Latinx artists. Please, Mari Carmen.
Thank you, Rose. Buenas noches a todos. Good evening to everyone. I would like to focus these brief introductory comments on the meaning of diaspora and diasporic art. Diaspora, as we know, refers to the dispersion of individuals from their homelands to their migration into a new environment. For a large percentage of Latinx artists, it has involved individuals or families fleeing from political oppression and poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean, and settling in the United States in search of enhanced opportunities or a better way of life. The untethering from one culture and the adaptation into a radically different context invariably results in a constant straddling back and forth between the new society and one's homeland. The artists associated with diasporic movements generally find themselves as either strangers in both cultures or those who can shift between the two, con un pie entre dos aguas. Insofar as it is embedded in two cultural realities, the art of any diaspora is by nature transnational and bicultural, or even multicultural. Like the individuals who produce it, diasporic art operates in the in-between space between two divergent cultural spheres. Artists thus appropriate and mix references from these contexts, while at the same time generating forms of art that have no easy national or geographic classification. They frequently rely on the resources of memory and myth to articulate and express their identities in the work they make, thus generating critical and important narratives that challenge prevailing canons of the new society, in this case, the United States. This practice allows them to claim some kind of ownership of both the originary and the newer culture, while at the same time establishing a physical and psychological presence for themselves in the midst of exile or displacement. Those who will engage with us in this conversation tonight have experienced the Latin American and Caribbean diasporas as either immigrants or children of immigrants. Drawing from firsthand experiences and family oral histories of migration, Maria Magdalena, Lucia, and Rosemary will discuss the impact these legacies have had on their practices and cultural production as artists, and most particularly as women artists. Among the specific issues they will address are the role of personal economies in the face of the overt commodification of consumer culture, the connection of their practice to cultures of origin, such as the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Mexico, and the role of craft as an invisible labor in diasporic art practices. Now, moving on to our artist presentation and question segment, I'd like to invite Lucia Hierro to share images with us first. Lucia?
Hello. I'd like to start with, first of all, just gratitude and my first slide. So this is a recent piece that I made for the Armory in New York art fair. And this piece came from a very personal sort of connection to this particular gesture, not so much the Café Bustelo, but even more specific, this rubber band, or this gesture that I call a gesture of saving. And I think before this, I didn't really want to go for such an obvious object, but this gesture really called to me. I would see it in my mother's home, in my house, this little red rubber band, and I made this in a very large form. So this is actually about 4.5 feet tall, almost 5 feet tall, or my height almost. You can move on to next slide. This is a recent exhibition that I had in Lausanne, Switzerland at Fabian Levy Gallery. This was my first solo show in Europe, and this was a very interesting space and place to find myself in. And I decided that the first thing that the viewer would see walking into the gallery would be images taken in Switzerland, in Lausanne, Switzerland. And one of the things that I really loved about the details in this piece, much like the rubber band in the Café Bustelo piece, that these pieces had these receipts with the names of the folks who are packaging the goods or the delivery packages. And so the titles, one is Manor Lunch Break. I'd followed folks around in the area where near my hotel, and everyone would take a lunch break and go and grab these little baguettes, and I was more focused on who was behind the register in all of these places. And there's a lot of Portuguese immigrants within Lausanne, and so these names on the receipts happen to be of basically immigrant workers, and same with all the delivery drivers. And so I wanted that to sort of be the entry point to the show that then would lead to the image in the next slide. So part of the exhibition was in another floor. So you really travel through and then arrive back in New York, in the neighborhood that I grew up in Washington Heights and Inwood, and where I currently reside. And these images were taken from my daily walks in the neighborhood, from local vendors, and this was even the lighting, that sort of sunset lighting that happens, and so it was important for me to go from a sort of mirror of themselves to then or a mirror to imperialism, to a more specific kind of consumption, a more personal, human, and sort of everyday consumption and interaction with objects. And there's no figures, so you become the figure, you become the person walking through this space and interacting with the space. And this was very important to me, because I didn't want an experience of a sort of othering, but that you sort of become part of the exhibition itself. Thank you.
Lucia, thank you for your insightful presentation. I would like to ask you, to the extent that your work focuses on the photographic representation of popular consumer brands, it immediately brings to mind the legacies of Andy Warhol and US pop artists. However, this initial perception proves to be wrong when we realize that the products you depict are those favored by the Latino population, all of which are embedded in a complex network of what you call personal economies. This strategy introduces a very different twist. Can you expand on that notion and what it means for your position as a New York-born and raised artist intimately associated with the Dominican diaspora?
That's a great question. I wouldn't say that they're wrong in making those connections to Warhol and pop artists. I would say that more than anything, those works are in conversation with those artists.
Granted, that's fine.
Yeah, I often mention how Warhol was a child of Slovak-speaking parents, the same way my parents were Spanish-speaking, and
that's a great point.
Yeah, and English is my second language. But I grew up in a neighborhood, as I mentioned before, where I still live now, that has been and always pretty much was a Dominican neighborhood. And I studied at some point in the Dominican Republic in really formative years, I think 8th through 10th grade. And I think as I got into college and was thinking about my position, basically going back and forth between these spaces, I really took to those similarities between me and, let's say, somebody like Warhol, because I really wanted to turn my focus on this sort of unspoken bond that immigrants and children of immigrants have and form around objects, how we construct a sense of belonging and through that an aesthetic reality. And I felt that was really important to document, because then that starts to point to larger questions of why. And I think this visual turn in my show in Switzerland was a way for me to, as I mentioned, point to imperialism, the H&Ms, the McDonald's, and all of that, but then bring it back and really up and close to those details of what I think, I have a lot of friends in urban planning, what they call a sort of aesthetic urban microspatiality. But I grew up with a father who's a performer and producer, and is part of the very fabric of merengue and popular Latin music. And so for me, that all felt very central and very big versus how I saw that music functioning in America at large. And so much the same way, I could say I saw that play out in the art world as well, right? I'd be in classes where I'd be learning about Jasper Johnson's American flag and not about Juan Sanchez. And I think that also say it was important to me to pay attention to how the larger picture affected the smaller picture and vice versa, because I was always afraid of the way this system uses and discards culture and people and real human lives. And I'll end it with, it's really interesting that Warhol's dad worked in a factory, and then he ended up taking back that factory, and the factory was indeed his own means of production, his studio.
Perfect. We will retake the conversation at the end. Now I will pass on the word to Rose.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lucia. I have some more questions for you, but as Mari Carmen mentioned, at the end, we're going to circle back to all three artists. We will ask them questions for group discussion, and we'll also have time for audience members to pose questions as well. And so right now, I'd like to invite Maria Magdalena to turn your video on and please introduce us to the artworks you've selected to share with us tonight before we move on to a question for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rose. And thank you to the organizers of the Latinx Artist Fellowship and Mari and Michelle. And thank you, Mari Carmen, as well, my fellow artists, Lucia and Rosemary. It's a privilege to be with all of you, and it's a privilege really to be a recipient of the Latinx Award. As mentioned before, issue of the diaspora and diaspora exploration or experience has been central to my work. And this was a difficult task to choose just 3 images to speak about it and maybe illustrate some ideas about how I have tried to approach a conversation with these topics in my work. But I'm going to start with the first image from 1999, the right protection. And I'm going to mention a bit of the time of the image because it was produced exactly 8 years after I had been relocated to United States. I studied in United States, I come back to Cuba, and then I returned back here in 1991, and I produced that image in 1999. And in the idea of the legacy of the diaspora, I was, and I still focusing so many times in my work, an idea of spirituality, the present, the materiality of what spirituality is, and also what I may be going to call the perceptual alertness that is part, particularly in the Black experience and the Black population of Caribbean people, both in the place of birth and in the place of exploration and present living. And I speak of that in personal terms, but I also know that this is something that is maybe common or found with fellow individuals coming from any part of the Caribbean, the larger islands. And I would talk to in this particular piece about sensorial awareness. The right protection was a piece inspired by a conversation with my father in the way from our home in the countryside in the province of Matanzas in Cuba, in a little village called La Vega, to go to the wood to get some plants to bring back to the family, and walking ahead of my father, and my father telling me that I have eyes in my bag. And it was a kind of a metaphor for some sort of a perceptual way of listening, or what I'm going to call the capacity of listening beyond the perceptual thing of just the ear. No, if we could hear with our skin, if we could hear with our hair, if we could hear with in some way through the membranes of the eyes, if we could hear through the olfactory capacity. So this kind of twisted, convoluted, integrated, undefined, but in a way that one cell become an entire sensorial being. And the best or the closest way that I could understand of that is the idea of spirituality. So one is alert in every direction, in every dimension, all the time. That has been a way of survival for the Black body in its diasporic experience, which doesn't start with just economical disenchantment of a political disruption, that is a start with an ancestral history of forced mobility for the well-being and the benefit of others, and in complex relations there. And I think that that's sort of a cap, a fundamental original energy, a maintained present to the entire history of the diaspora experience. So the image number first, which is the right protection, present this young woman with a very flat, perfect skin in the back of her body, and all these eyes that are both coming from the body but projected in the body, and pleasant. And in the second image, which I'm going to ask to come to the second image for 2004, beholders, voyeurs and beholders of, and I'm going to mention the previous image is a photogravure with handmade paper and handmade painted paper pulp. So each piece in the edition is different. In this second image, Voyeur and Beholder of 2004, the medium changed. This is a painterly photographic experiment in which a sculptural experiment in which the rim of where the eyelashes would be in the eyes are made with hair, human hair, in a sort of a drawing-like a proposition for construction of photography. Is no a photograph of an event, is a constructed situation to be captured through this medium, and is all eyes, all colors, all form, and the eyes are tearing. This is a Polaroid in many of the kind of performative Polaroid photograph that I explored from the early 90s to now. And it contextualized, I would say, the same learners. But I think in this piece more as a reference of the construction of idea of witnessing, beholder, participant of an story that this is not only emanating from energy within the body, but is imposed upon the body, and is sorrow, and is sorrowful, and is could be read in many ways, and it could be described to performing in many situations. Tears could be, I think, could be interpreted both as sorrowful, but it could be joyful. I don't going to define in the conversation how this piece structured itself, but in the period in which it's historically made, 2004, there are all kinds of circumstances, political, that may be affecting how this piece is going to be read. The third piece, just finishing, like last week or so, is called or titled Testigo. And Testigo is the same body of a Black woman in the sort of simplicity of naked self, but this bag now is not just flat, perfect skin. It has years passed through it. It has wrinkles. It has accumulated fat. It have the time they have passed by. And the eyes are multiple, and the tears are from the top to the bottom of the image. And again, I will say that what still talking about this perceptual alertness, but also is talking about accumulation of memory and the transformation of the entity of self in the experience of diaspora. The accent of tear in the first image speak of eyes open to see, to protect, to understand, to learn, with this kind of a joy of the journey ahead, because it's always hope in the journey ahead. And the image in 2023 are other eyes, seen by the lens of ophthalmologist, with a little bit of cataracts starting to form. The body is still aging as well, and the tears are deeper. It's autobiographical, but it's also a reading of the time. When I was doing the piece Testigo, I was feeling two things. I am not forced to title my work all the time in English. There is enough Latino population in this country for me to be able to speak at times just in the tongue of my birth, Spanish. The word has browned, or I don't know if this is a correct word in English, but the word has been turned into this melanin brown overall population, and then Latinx is becoming a very much a majority and a typical representation of what we are, and that perceptual awareness and sensorial awareness as well is everywhere. And for me, I am thinking about how all those small coordinates reposition what it is to be a Latinx, what is to be in exile, what is that constitute diaspora. And what I'm thinking in the structure of these three pieces, in this idea of the body as a conduit of energy up and in, out and in, receiving and releasing, I am thinking about both the instability of sight, the instability of place, the temporality of our being, the temporality of our sensations, and also the temporality of home, both in a practical sense, in a very short experiential time of a life, 60 years, or 50 years, or 40 years, but it's a metaphor for diaspora, not just as a Caribbean, Latino, immigrant experience, but diaspora in a perceptual way as a potential, a probability for us humans in our entity of being in this tiny little planet, in that tiny little thing, en el cual lo mismo puedo hablar en español, que puedo hablar en inglés, que puedo hablar en Yoruba. ¿Por qué? Because all the things that make us perceive, sense, and to be are very, very similar, are very similar in the temporality and the connection of who we are. So what I am thinking about, what would be the fourth image in this 3 images that it was invited to show now? I don't know, it will be this body searching for the next home. And the next home is not just from Cuba to Nashville or to Boston or Milan. The next home is from here to another spot in the universe. And through those eyes in the body, and through those eyes in the space, we could sense, perceive, and understand those dimensions. That's it.
Wow, Magda, thank you so much for giving us such amazing insight into the 3 works, which were made over a span of nearly 25 years. From the earliest work, we saw a photograph of your back, hand embellished with eyes. And in the most recent work we see here, a painting with a similar motif of eyes, though these eyes, like the grid work in the middle slide that we saw, are those that shed tears. You mentioned, that tears can be both joy or sorrow. And I wonder if you could give us some insight into why these eyes shed tears now and not 2.5 decades earlier with the first piece. And I wonder if you could tell us what draws you to duality.
Well, I mean, such a good question. I would say that I was listening when Mari Carmen was talking with Lucia, and she said, "Con un pie en las 2 aguas." There is another piece of mine from many years ago that is between 2 waters, no, or the las 2 aguas. So I know specifically that. But I think because duality is everything that we are and everything that we perceive is in relation, is the self in relation with experience and back and forth. But why no tears? I think when I did the piece, The Right Protection, it was an homage to my father. It was an homage to the silent conversations, the entire conversation in which words were not exchanged, but it was through energy, in a few steps ahead, a few steps behind. We were always having conversations, and this is hard to explain. It's non-verbal. So this is what I go to image, and I go to make this body that could see, not only because I have a desire, because it was spoken to me by my father when he said, "You have eyes in your back, and you could see through your back." No, I didn't know that, but I know what it means. And Rose, when I was doing the testigo, I was thinking about what the body have witnessed, in so many years. As I was working in that piece in my studio here in Tennessee, it was another mass shooting very close to where my studio is. And I started crying. in the spot, start and literary, and it's a testigo. It's testigo of so many unrespond experiences, of so many moment of absolutely another piece of mine from 2010 say unspeakable sorrow. Unspeakable sorrow you cannot talk about, you cannot, I don't know, see, I would be the writer, maybe I could write about as a musician, but because I'm a visual artist, all that I could do is painted, sculptured, performer. So in this case, and in this piece, which they are a lot of black tears. There are a lot of tears that is the body excreting himself in a way, is his own energy. So I don't know. I usually have more words or more capacity to structure around what ideas. Definitely, I was interested in two scenes. I wanted to because the particularity of those pieces being self-representation of women body, and one piece from a period in which that conversation of body politics was so important, and a piece in which we are in a different moment of that. But I retrieved that piece to keep saying, well, when the woman is not anymore accepted of wrinkles, when this body start become a wrinkle and is not going through, I don't know, or the wonderful methods that are there to enhance the body, but it's not that, and then you let those skin and sex being seen. So in that piece, it's delicate, it's minimum, but it's there. The little donut close to the waistline, moving from some important small conversation about representation of self and what it means for a woman to see itself and represent itself, and in that. But it's also what it be, because it's right protection, be voyeurs and beholder of, and then testigo, and this place of back to Spanish, back to Spanish, back to feel enough people to hear y que pueden entender de alguna manera u otra, y darle espacio a la oportunidad de hablar en español aquí, ahora, en este momento de mi experiencia en la diáspora.
Thank you so much, Magda. This is just really deep, and you said you didn't have words because you're a visual artist, but you have many words, and you provided so much depths and detail into these three works. And I hope we can return in the questions at the end to perhaps give you some more time. But right now, I'd like us to give Rosemary Meza-DesPlas some time to share her works that she selected for us today, which I think, you started mentioning like the women's body, which does relate to the works that Rosemary is going to share with us in a bit. Rosemary, can you please, oh, there you are. Please share with us your images. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose. I'm so honored to be here in this program tonight with Lucia and Magda. I am in New Mexico, and I'd like to acknowledge I live and work on the land of the Navajo, Southern Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Apache. First slide, please. The first work I wanted to share with you this evening is a work called The Invisible Woman Syndrome. It's an installation, and the title comes from a term describing what happens to women over 50 in society. America's youth-obsessed culture places a high value on a woman's physical appearance, and aging, therefore, leads to invisibility. The artwork is part of a larger series titled Miss Nalgas USA. This is actually the breakfast nook of the pageant winner, refried rosy frijoles. The installation presents to the viewer a dichotomy of presence and absence. The apron of the character, refried rosy frijoles, is on display, but she's nowhere in sight. Names of Latina activists are hand embroidered upon deconstructed, reconstructed soft bra sculptures, which dangle from the tablecloth like Mexican pom-pom ball fringe. The names serve to underscore the lack of intersectionality in feminist history. Two of the Latina activists included are Adelina Otero Warren and Isa Noyola. Adelina Otero Warren was a suffragist in New Mexico who was the first Hispanic woman to run for a seat in the US Congress. Isa Noyola is a Latina transgender activist and a national leader in the LGBT immigrant rights movement. And set upon this table, there are tortillas and beans, and they act as signifiers of ethnic identity, ethnic authenticity, and colorism. Who is an authentic Latino? In the background, the framed watercolor titled "This Is Not a Taco" is a humorous nod to Renee Magritte's The Treachery of Images. At the same time, it pokes fun at the marketing gimmick of Taco Tuesday. Next slide, please. This is a photograph documentation of my performance, Miss Nalgas USA 2022. This performance artwork exemplifies my commitment to the representation of Latinas in visual art, alongside a concurrent focus on ethnic identity, beauty standards, and aging. In this image, refried rosy frijoles is giving an acceptance speech in the performance artwork. It was a one-night-only performance that occurred at the Farmington Civic Center on November 12, 2022 in Farmington, New Mexico. The creation of this performance artwork was funded by the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the Frederick Hammersley Fund for the Arts at the Albuquerque Community Foundation. I wrote the script, made the costumes and the props, and then I invited members of my Farmington, New Mexico community to join me in this parody of a beauty pageant. So 3 contestants vie for the honor of being Miss Nalgas USA 2022. Ideal beauty is explored in this performance through monologues, skits, and trivia. The stereotype of Latinas and US popular culture translates as nearly white, but brown enough to count as different. This feminist performance used humor to challenge misconceptions about ethnic identity and aging. I played the title character, refried rosy frijoles, and in this image, upcycling my own wedding dress for my costume, the back skirt that you see features Mesoamerican motifs related to land, crops, and water. My bean-centric character is a reference to family history, to labor and commerce. My mother's family came to the US as immigrant farm workers, and my father worked as a cook throughout his life. Next slide, please. This is not Rosie's butt, and also this is not J-Lo's butt, and this is not Shakira's butt. So these are my latest works. They're soft sculptures, and they will be in my upcoming exhibition at Amos Eno Gallery in Brooklyn, which opens on May 5th. By manipulating my photographs in a software program, I designed pinto bean fabric. In this fabric, along with serape material, mariachi buttons, felt, thread, and wool were used to fabricate these three-dimensional abstract buttocks. These works examine the intersection of body image, gender, and food. Correlations have been made between food and a woman's figure, pear shape, apple bottom, melons. In these works, the humble pinto bean is blown up larger in scale, and it creates the contours of the buttocks. The serape fabric slides up and alludes to the gluteal cliff or the thong. And this is not Rosie's butt. Serape fabric flips over one side like a saddlebag. And saddlebag is also a term used to describe fat around a woman's hips and thighs. While prevalent thin beauty ideal reigns supreme for American white women, cultural expectations regarding standards of beauty for Latina women favor a larger bust, thin waist, rounded derrieres. And of course, on a personal level, these works touch upon my own complex relationship with my own body image. The mariachi buttons reference a Mexican musical genre, but they also serve to accentuate the curvature of the buttocks form. With playful contradiction, each soft sculpture's title denies being the butt, the famous Latina in popular culture. So this is not J-Lo's butt. This is not Shakira's butt.
Rosemary, thank you so much for sharing with the audience and us here tonight some insights into the work. And I find myself absorbed by the way that you underscore the experience of being Latina in the public eye, the intersectional experience of being a racialized and sexualized brown woman in particular. Together, we've spoken about your experiences growing up in Texas to a large, mostly woman and girl-led family, and how your work is informed by these experiences as well as informed by feminist thought. I wonder, could you share with our audiences a specific story, writer, or other artist that informs refried Rosie Frijoles and her adventures from Invisible Woman to Miss Nalgas USA?
Thank you for that question, Rose. So my artwork is definitely grounded in feminism, and I find a great deal of inspiration in the writings by women, such as Clementine Ford, Rebecca Traister, Sarah Thornton. But I wanted to specifically talk about writings that have influenced me recently. And those would be writings by Arlene Davila and Amelia Meza-DesPlas. The first artwork that I shared, The Invisible Woman Syndrome, takes a cue from Domesticana, The Sensibility of Chicana Rosquache, an essay by Meza-DesPlas. So the installation depicts domestic items and incorporates the femininity of materials. The breakfast nook of refried Rosie Frijoles anchors the artwork to the realm of the domestic, but the soft brass sculptures are what link it to the home altar. So I see the tablecloth with those dangling sculptures as serving as an altar to Latina feminism. And the soft brass sculptures reflect both the maternal and the sexual. So there's this kind of playful subversion that exists in the installation through the imagery and also the cultural materials. The kitchen scene is not a patriarchal prison, but it's actually reflecting this kind of defiant feminist personality of refried Rosie Frijoles. The second work I was talking about was the performance artwork, Miss Nalga's USA 2022, was inspired by Arlene Davila's book, Latinos Inc., The Marketing and Making of a People. In it, she discusses the commodification of ethnicity and the re-authentication of US minorities in terms of the right way of being an ethnic. And so these ideas in her book led me to think and ask a lot of questions in my studio, like, what does it mean to be a Latina in the United States? Am I ethnic enough? Within mass media, how is the image of the Latina sold to the mainstream public? How is culture watered down, diluted, and sold to the mainstream public? So my script for the performance included words and concepts directly from Davila's book, like Walter Cronkite Spanish, the acronym MEL, mostly English Latino, or Don't Panic, I'm Hispanic. So paying homage to Ms. Davila's ideas about marketing Latinos, I decided for this performance piece, I would use the format of a beauty pageant to talk about how America's beauty pageants have sold us on an idea, a concept of beauty, of youthful beauty, of what body standards are ideal. And Miss Nalga's USA pokes fun of the pageant concept and its role in kind of promoting this feminine American identity. So the pageant, Miss America pageant, has actually a legacy of racial exclusion, and it was targeted by feminists in the 1960s. There's only one Latina who was ever crowned Miss America in its 100-year history, and her name was Charlene Wells Hawks. So that's a little bit about the writings that influenced the work. Thank you, Rose.
Thanks so much for sharing in detail exactly how the essays or the books directly informed particular artworks. That was really deep and insightful to me too. And so I want to take the time now to invite everyone to turn on all the artists to turn on their cameras so that we can start a group discussion. Mari Carmen has a question to start us off. Those in the audience, if you have a question, please leave them in the chat, and Michelle Ruiz and I think Mary Thomas will be fielding those questions into a document. So I'll be able to ask a couple. Please, Mari Carmen.
Yes, I want to thank Rosemary and Magda and Lucia again for their fantastic presentations and the insightful way and stimulating way in which they responded to our questions. And I want to throw out a question to the three of you, and you are welcome to either answer it or not. I want to go back to one of the key features that I identified as identifying diasporic art, which is this notion of biculturalism or even multiculturalism. And I believe Magda has also addressed that when she talks about duality and how important that is in her work. And of course, we have listened to Rosemary and Lucia also talk about how their cultures of origin have had an extreme influence on their art. So my question to you, to the three of you, is bearing in mind that identity is not a fixed category, where do you position yourselves in terms of your identities? You are all, I believe, American citizens. Do you see yourself as American US artists, or artists who partake of two or more culture, races, and ethnicities? Where do we situate you in this very broad frame? Magda, you want to start? You have to unmute yourself.
Well, I only start if either Rosemary or Lucy want me to, otherwise I could wait. But
No, go ahead, go ahead.
But very important question, Mari Carmen, and a complex question, because I feel that would be not really smart to say that the duality or the multiplicity or plurality of experience in the diaspora is not present. No, yes, in my case, an American citizen, but I lived many years in US just as a resident alien. That particular term that is so complex. And I think that is a process of, like in terms of Cuba anthropology, we would say Fernando Ortiz, acculturation, no, all of that. But I am curious about the beyond that, no, the aspect of construction of self and understanding of self, with the implication that no culture is stable by itself, that what is American is not defined by a generation that come in the Mayflower and they establish this is America, lily white and nothing else. That American is itself to a complexity of multiplicity of ethnicity, geography, way of existing, tradition that come here and build something that is changing as we speak. No, that is mutating into something new. And what I try to understand, what is my role as an interpreter or performer through the artwork that I produce of that mutation that is vivid. And that's what I choose for this conversation, the piece of the eyes, because it was about perception. It was about sensorial perception that is alive, that is in the moment, that is real. That's what it is. I don't know. Some people think that I am not American. I am as much American as Cuban, as a woman from African descent, with Chinese descendants, all of that together. What is that? A metamorphosis, a process in mutating, changing, and that's the beauty of it. And that, I think, this too that made America, because the complexity of the encounter here, an incredible ground still for newness and for the opportunity not yet seen.
Absolutely. Thank you for that fantastic answer that takes it to a really high level. I think it's the key to what we're living today. And of course, I asked that question because I'm in that situation too, being a Puerto Rican, having lived in the United States almost 40 years, and yet feeling myself that I'm a stranger in this culture. But at the same time, I am part of this culture. So we live in that duality, that does not resolve itself in one way or another. But of course, we're in a country that is transforming itself more to what our experience is than to this fixed notion of the Mayflower and those who came in the Mayflower. I mean, that idea of America really is completely out of date at this point. So thank you for bringing that out. Lucia or Rosemary, do you want to address the question?
So I know the question is about really ethnicity, race, and culture, but when I think of myself as an artist and describe myself as an artist, I always start by saying a woman artist. I feel like I navigate the world as a woman, and then I'm perceived. I'm invited into spaces, or I'm received into spaces, public spaces, as a woman. When I think of ethnicity and race and culture, I think of myself as being bicultural, as being both American and Mexican, as being raised with customs that are both American customs and Mexican customs. But I also see myself as a mestiza, as Spanish and Cohuitlacan. I think that I grew up in Texas, but having been in New Mexico, I am much more now aware of indigeneity. And that's really just been a change that's happened since I moved here in 2016. So kind of a recent understanding of culture and where that I might fit into that block or structure. So I think I just see myself constantly kind of evolving and growing, and then my knowledge of culture growing. And I hope that my learning and understanding of indigeneity, my own indigeneity, that it also grows.
I think that's an outcome of the diasporic experience. Of course, no identity is fixed, and everybody's many different kinds of identities in one person, one individual shares many different levels of identity. But I think people who have experienced diaspora are far more attuned to that multiplicity of identities and levels of identification than people who have just grown up in one culture. I think that's a fact that we have to contend with. But I think it adds a level of complexity to the experience, which is not negative. I mean, being part of the diaspora is not a negative experience, but I think it's a very enriching experience ultimately, despite the fact that it brings trauma with it and that there's levels of suffering and marginalization that come with living in an alien culture that rejects you or that doesn't understand where you're coming from. But at the end, I think it is an asset. Both in personal terms as well as cultural and artistic terms too. So, Lucia, do you have something another perspective to add?
Sure. I mean, both responses are responses I feel I deeply agree with. I would say that just dealing in the everyday now, because that's, as you heard the other answers, these are multi-level questions. But dealing in the sort of plainer now, I usually go with Dominican American. And I think if I want to get really specific, I'm Dominican American New Yorker, which is like a much more specific identity that I feel would encompass all the things that I have lived so far. But I will say that, you know, I always mention growing up in this musical household because music really shaped my worldview. And I think that through watching my father interact with other musicians, I mean, a lot of the times they didn't speak the same language. They were recording in a studio and music was the language that they were connecting with. And as you know, music is connected to math, and math is a universal language. There's all these different really beautiful things about it. And much the same way I would say that the notion of Caribbeanness or of the diaspora, as you mentioned, it does shape a worldview. You do start to understand what's a good, you know, analogy or metaphor, but like the day in the life of a coin or something. And so that's sort of the way that I see my identity. And that's why I also submitted those photos from Switzerland, in that, you know, I was finding connections in the ways in which we all have relationships to all the good and bad that comes with consumption.
Great. Thank you. Rose, should we go on to questions from the audience?
Yep. So we have a question from one of our audience members, Jose Sanchez, who's wondering how the artists here, how they feel their work intersects with contemporary decolonizing efforts, however they might define that. If so, how can you explain how, and if not, where does that differ? So again, do you feel your work intersects with contemporary decolonizing efforts? If yes, how so? If not, how do your efforts differ?
So I'm going to respond to that in a way that I believe, for instance, in the case of my work and these three pieces, as I mentioned in the beginning, I would say that maybe a centered aspect of conceptual aspect of my work is a spirituality, and claiming and speaking from such a position is already a decolonizing proposition in a way, and in the way that a woman like any of the three of us, I speak by myself, but I could say, you know, another Caribbean, Latin American, or indigenous artist, there is a space, and this is not just, and I'm going to say, yes, there is a spirituality in art by, you know, the spiritual in the art was wrote by an abstract painting, but this is about a spirituality with an ancestral taking and a position of energies and metaphysics and other components that are very much culture surviving, culture refusing to be constrained and refusing to be stopped or prevented from being. So that is an act of defiance, and that is an act of affirmation, and through that there is the colonialization is at full range, if we want to call it that way. How is contemporary? Well, look, okay, we are living in this time. Everything that we are showing to you is a discourse that belongs to conceptual ideas and that define what is visuality in our time. So we are totally participating in a discourse and narrative that constructing the language of our time. And as I think, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a woman of African descent, when I claim that territory, I call myself a curandera, a healer. Well, yes, that's what I am. And I'm using the tools and of my art as nomenclature to build that. That is the colonial gesture.
So if I can chime in here after Magda, I'd like to just say that I think in terms of decolonization, when I know that it seems as if there's a lot of humor in my work, there is, but I'm also thinking about the imagery that I'm going to present. And so for refried rosy frijoles, yeah, it's a funny name, but also using the imagery of the pinto bean, the bean. Well, the bean is an indigenous crop. And so I'm acknowledging that by using the imagery, but it's also a crop that's also important to the Hispanic in New Mexico. It's actually one of the major crops in New Mexico. In Estancia, New Mexico, they actually have a pinto bean fiesta. So, and it's also something that's also just as a crop important in the Southwest, inclusive of Texas, which is where I was born. So I feel like when I think of imagery and start to use imagery, the imagery itself is going back to thinking in terms of decolonization and acknowledging the indigenous.
Lucia, would you like to chime in?
This one's a tough one for me, in that I think I've always held a belief that there can be changes within spaces of academia, institutions, and things like that. And I've seen the sacred parts of those places. I don't think that unless you've been in a situation where you're in a classroom with other very serious artists and other academics, that you can necessarily understand the real beauty that can exist within those spaces, and the types of very profound conversations that then lead to the work that is shared out in the world. think that for the most part, I've tried my best for the work to steer institutions to really do what they say what they purport to do, right? And as was mentioned, moving through the world as a woman has definitely, you know, I understand that I don't move like many women move. My job is to come in here, is to come into this art studio and create out of my mind things, and then have conversations with the public about that. So I understand that I also live within a framework and within this sort of freedom that has not been historically the case for women. So yeah, it's a complicated question, because one is in the system, one is having this conversation funded by the Ford Foundation, and you know, like we're in it, but we are also disrupting it in a sense all at once. It's a paradox, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, we actually have a question from an audience member that kind of picks up on some of these themes. This was from Angelica Tapia, who was relating her experience as a Latina MFA student and navigating a mostly white institution. And so I'm wondering if the three of you could share some of your experiences of navigating the art world, which is mostly white, especially as women of color, which you started sharing a bit, Lucia, with us just now.
I'll jump in here. It's an odd thing to navigate the arts, whether it's in academia or in institutions, as a woman of color. The MFA program that I was in, and this was years and years and years ago, it was I was the only Latina in the group, and it was mostly men and only 3 women. So I think going to spaces and seeing the inequity in terms of the number of men versus women in an exhibit, and then seeing the inequity in terms of how many women of color are included is difficult to see all the time. And when you see a change, a small change in any institution, I'm always thankful. I think change happens in incremental steps. And when you see those small changes, it's important to be thankful for them. I don't know if I have any advice in terms of how to specifically navigate those spaces, but that's what I wanted to add.
I want to add a bit to that. I forgot to say in the beginning, my title at Vanderbilt, I am the Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair Professor of Fine Arts at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And when I came here 5 years ago, and took a little bit of time to understand the city, to understand, of course, understand the region from being here. But then I went and founded EADJ, Engine for Art, Democracy, and Justice. And I want to invite you all to check at Vanderbilt, EADJ.edu, and see the program that I have instituted here. And as we talk now, I helped to launch the first Tennessee triennial, a 4-city project across the state of Tennessee under the conceptual topic of repair, R-E-P-A-R. And I used that kind of a Spanish intromission of distortion of the word repair to speak about both looking at the past and looking at the potentiality of future. So what I trying to at least propose from my experience, is to using a situation of an institution with historical limitations about understanding or accepting or expanding everything that is pertinent for colonial, because my own title, Cornelius Vanderbilt, is so complex, the daughter of slave descendants with a slave owner, fundamental. But I am thinking about the mutation of culture, the transformation of culture, and the missing opportunity of what it is to be the woman that I am and that we are maybe collectively in this particular time, in this particular history, in these particular circumstances. And I'm sorry that I'm going to come back to be the biculture or triculture of multiple culture, but it's something absolutely wonderful and redemptive about that. And it's something true as well. It's particularly powerful in the American experience about that. When I think in my title, I think this is the kind of scenes that only happen as well in America. And to that, I have an incredible sense of both tears of joy and tears of sorrows. Back to my work in that's what I'm experiencing, and that's what I'm trying to do. Make those tears powerful rivers of cleansing water that could open incredible new sources of beginnings that we don't know yet how they could evolve.
I just want to check, Lucia, if you want to.
Yeah, I think that was so beautiful. Sorry, I'm kind of in a trance with that. But yeah, the MFA experience is such a complex one, but I'm really appreciative of it and the other artists that I got to spend time with while in school, and the brilliant people that I got to study with. You know, folks like Kelly Jones and Erica James and Robert Ferris Thompson and all of these, you know, just, you know, Nicola Y, and the list goes on of the folks that just really changed my life and continue to make great art and continue to write beautiful things. And but my advice is to really seek that out. I think focus, you know, if you give too much attention to the negative aspects, it really will consume you. And it's a way, it's also a tactic to keep you, you know, to keep you stuck in that. I think when you start to really find your people and find your place and find that magic, you'll find it. You really will. You really can. And if you really love the thing that you say you love to study, you're going to be happy because you have the time to do it, and you're going to be in it, despite what's around you. So I think that's my advice, is to sort of be in it, really.
Thank you, Lucia. I have another question here from Mary Thomas. She relates how each of your practices engage with tensions inherent in materiality. For example, the materiality of personal economies, the materiality of the spiritual, or the material traces of the human body or even food. And she asks, how does your work address or complicate the tensions in materiality, and how do the legacies of diaspora layer into these tensions? Magda, would you like to start us off?
I have been in many, to be specific in these three pieces, the problem is that is the materiality of the spiritual, but also the imminent presence of the spiritual. No, so in the work, I am and the complexity of the materiality, the representation of those things. But I think that in the work, I try to there is a versatility, I would say, of disciplines in my work, even in these three projects. The very first project is a mix of photo and printmaking, you know, and in very traditional and unexpected juxtapositions. As you know, I make paper, but then I paint as making the pieces and marking the paper with very specific color for the eye, so each one of them doesn't repeat. So it's this temporary quality of them. The second one is a Polaroid with the performativity aspect of that. And this last piece is just watercolor, ink, and gouache. So I have been spending a lot of hours of intimacy, profound intimacy. At some point, crying in some of the pieces when I was painting the tears and mixing tears in the paint because they would drop in there. And I have mixed many scenes in my paintings. I think that almost every residual scene coming out of my body has been merged in some of my work through the stem of my career. And there is a spiritual practice. That is the creation of amulet. That is the creation of protection materiality. So the right protection is to carry within yourself a packet of of capacity holder of energy, from stones to powder to waters to metal, and it's all connected with being in a geography, with being in a particular territory. When we all acknowledge the ancestral ground that we are in recognizing indigeneity is also recognizing geography, recognizing land, recognizing mineral, territory, plants, everything. And all of that, for me, it have informed I think that my body of work is all full. You know, I think in same period, the herbalist tool, or a year before, the Spoken Softly with Mama, it's about, or the most recent piece that I have done, liminal circularities and familiar murmur, is a conversation in the family. What kind of materiality is to sitting in a room with 6, 7, 8 women that you love, and smile, dance, cook, talk about the past, the present, the future, laugh, cry together. How do you combat that in form that could be really accessed by others? What is that? What is that experience? That's what I honor over and over. Somebody like Lygia Clark, you know, that throw you in the ground and put plastic stone. So and that when I'm sorry that I get all in too many places, but that is the colonization. No, that is to access language and materials others that the word present as contemporary, as rightfully so artistic, or rightfully so the language that we need to speak. All those are a space of freedoms that I have taken, and the many women that I love and respect are male, but women, and in these two artists that are speaking with me, I could see it. I could see similarities and path of incredible unhinged and and let out unknown powers. Who knew the nalgas, whatever the name was, which I was laughing and I love it, you know, but I say how brilliant, how brave to take that and put it out there as material to be confronted in the conversation of art. How brilliant is that? So that's what I'm thinking, that and I think for me is no, if we are in the middle of a journey We are as most voyeurs and beholder of it. We do not yet. We are in the middle of that, making this process, that struggle, that unknown, and that is the beauty. And again, in the complexity of the multi-dimension of the experience of diaspora, there is an incredible fertile ground still in which this place is. And I am so grateful for that. And I celebrate that. And this sounds like almost I'm doing something patriotic here. No, but it's defending that space of freedom and that space of diaspora in his multiplicity, in his own dimension. And I think that I don't have anything else left to say after this, but I am so grateful that I could participate with all of you in this conversation and in the privilege of this opportunity that is this grant to sing, to argue, to dare to say things and try.
Thank you so much, Magda. I'm just looking at a message from Michelle. We only have, I think, just 2 minutes left. And so is that correct, Michelle? Yeah. So we have several other questions, and I'm afraid we don't have time then to ask them. There is a really great question posed by someone anonymously about who's been influential in feeling you, in making you feel rooted in your artistic practice. And how do these relationships connect to the concept of legacy or the practice of legacy building? I would have loved more time with that. But Michelle, you have some closing remarks, and I just want to take this time to thank you, Lucia and Magda and Rosemary, for sharing your work with us this evening. It was a really great pleasure to be in dialogue with you, and we look forward to continuing to follow your art practices and work. And special thanks to the MFAH staff, and especially to USLA's Michelle Ruiz for helping us organize today's events. And last but not least, thank you to our audience for spending your evenings with all of us. We really appreciate your interest in the exciting artworks of our colleagues here and your ongoing engagement with Latinx art through the XAS Intersection program. And I'm so sad. I wish we could continue speaking more, but hopefully, you know, those conversations can happen in the gallery spaces or future programs, etc. So thank you all tonight for your time.
I want to second Rose and thank all of you as well as the audience. Muchas gracias. It's been an amazing conversation. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye, good night.
Thank you.